After more than 15 years of 18-wheeler driving, Mike Henderson came across something that would follow him for the rest of his life. On a chilly February evening in 2018, Mike was traveling along Interstate 25 from Phoenix to Denver with a load of electronics. He was accustomed to the loneliness, the long miles of pitch-black roadway, and the peculiar cast of personalities that appeared after midnight because he was a seasoned night driver. However, nothing had been ready for what transpired between 2 a.m. and daybreak, those dreadful hours. Just outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico, the trouble began. A battered white vehicle was parked in the shadows close to the edge of the lot when Mike stopped into a truck stop to get coffee and look at his logbook. The car itself wasn't out of the ordinary. Across America, truck stops were dotted with several broken-down cars. His gaze was drawn to the lifeless man sitting behind the wheel, looking straight at him through the glass. It looked like a middle-aged man with hollow cheeks and stringy hair. Mike could sense the intensity of that stare even from 50 yards away. His skin crawled. In an attempt to dispel the sensation, he hurriedly completed his tasks and got back into his taxi. He looked in his mirrors as he left the truck stop and turned back onto I-25 heading north. He was being followed by the white automobile. Mike initially convinced himself that it was merely a coincidence. Perhaps the man was also going north. However, the sedan consistently stayed roughly a quarter of a mile behind his trailer as the miles passed. The automobile sped up when Mike did. It also slowed down when he did. The vehicle changed lanes when he did. The headlights in his reflection seemed to loom large and ominous all the time. At around 3 a.m., Mike made the decision to investigate his doubts. He circled around the deserted streets of Santa Rosa, a small town, before returning to the freeway. His precise path was followed by the white sedan, which never drew nearer or retreated. Mike's hands on the steering wheel started to perspire. This was no accident. He was being purposefully stalked. There was tremendous psychological pressure. Those headlights were there every time Mike looked in his mirrors, staring at him like eyes in the dark. He attempted to use his CV radio to call other truckers, but few drivers were awake and talkative due to the late hour. The loneliness was debilitating. The pursuit went on with mechanical precision, mile after mile, hour after hour. The driver's actions made it even more horrifying. Typical stalkers may attempt to pass, make menacing gestures, or make contact of some sort. None of stuff was done by this individual. With the patience of a predator, they merely followed, keeping that precise distance, never faltering, never revealing their intentions. The ambiguity was frustrating. The possibilities rushed through Mike's head. Was this a murderous spree? Who was the target of truck drivers? Had he heard tales of highway murderers who preyed on lonesome motorists? Was he going to be robbed at a gas station, or was it worse than that? This could be the start of a complex multi-vehicle trap. By 4 in the morning, Mike was struggling with panic. His coffee was chilly. Static crackled on his radio, and like luminous eyeballs, those headlights stayed glued to his mirrors. He thought about dialing 911, but what would he say to them? That he was on a public roadway with someone driving behind him. Instead of dealing with paranoid drivers frightened by traffic, police dealt with actual crimes. Then something was different. The vehicle started to get closer as they got closer to the Colorado border. It approached Mike's trailer slowly and deliberately. A 4-mile changed to 500, then 300, then 200 yards. Mike felt his heart pounding in his chest. Why was the stalker now approaching after hours of keeping a perfect distance? When Mike noticed a rest area up ahead, he knew the answer. As he saw the white automobile take the off-ramp and vanish into the night in his mirror as he passed the exit. Mike felt a surge of physical relief wash over him. The nightmare was over. It wasn't over, though. Mike was running the same trip from Phoenix to Denver 3 weeks later. The same section of I-25, but with a different load and night. At 2:30 in the morning, just south of Albuquerque, he noticed something familiar in his mirrors. The same meticulous stalking conduct, the same hollow-faced driver, and the same exact quarter-mile distance were all displayed by a white vehicle. Mike was prepared now. He had 911 on speed dial and his phone charged. Once more, though, the car followed for hours without posing any threat. Vanished at the Colorado border, and Mike began to doubt his own sanity. What kind of person followed random truck drivers all night long? What was the purpose? A month later, the third confrontation took place. Same white vehicle, same time, same route. Mike had done his homework by now. He had posted on trucking forums, gotten in touch with other drivers, and even called state police. He was completely chilled by what he found. There were other victims besides Mike. At least 7 additional truck drivers reported being trailed by a white automobile on I-25 through New Mexico during the 2017 and 2018 period. The same section of highway every time. Always from 2 a.m. until 6 a.m. Constantly the same pattern of conduct, meticulous following, flawless distance keeping, and disappearance at the Colorado border. However, there was more. Following their interactions, 2 drivers said they had learned their personal information. Residences. Someone had done research and collated the names of family members and work schedules. Evidence of someone spying his house was discovered by one driver. His wife had been followed to work, another found out. The ramifications were horrifying. This wasn't just any harassment on the highway. The highway was being used by someone to find and investigate possible victims. Following the patient for hours was more than just mental anguish. They were reconnaissance. The stalker was picking up habits, routines, and routes, constructing records on lone drivers who followed recognizable routes throughout desolate terrain. The identity of the driver of the white vehicle remained unknown to Mike. Despite several law enforcement agencies receiving reports, the stalker was never apprehended by agencies. In late 2018, the encounters ceased as strangely as they had started. Perhaps the individual went to a new hunting area. In another state, they might have escalated to more serious offenses. Or perhaps they are still searching for their next opportunity while driving around dark roadways. Victim. Mike was irrevocably altered by the encounter. He never takes the same route twice, carries pepper spray, and has several dash cams installed. He keeps a constant distance behind him and continuously checks his mirrors, feeling his heart race anytime he sees headlights. What happened to Mike isn't the most terrifying aspect. That's what might have occurred to drivers who were less cautious, unlucky, or unprepared. Predators have countless opportunities to prey amid the wide emptiness of the American highway system, where cell coverage is sporadic and assistance can be hours away. Thousands of truck drivers drive alone across dark interstates every night, leaving them open to attack by anyone who is twisted enough to turn the highway system into their own hunting field. Mike's tale serves as a warning that the true monsters aren't supernatural. They are people. They have patience. They are currently waiting in the shadows between cities, anticipating their next chance to transform a person's everyday drive into a nightmare that will follow them for the rest of their lives. After 12 years of transporting freight throughout the Midwest, Tommy Rodriguez learned that the frequency that altered everything. In January 2019, a severe snowfall closed majority of Interstate 70 during an especially harsh winter drive from Chicago to Kansas City. Tommy was one of the few insane drivers who continued to roll through the whiteout. Other truckers were warning him over his CB radio about impassable roads and jackknifed semis up ahead. Tommy's CB began acting strangely around 3 in the morning, somewhere in the middle of rural Missouri. The typical banter from other drivers faded into static, replaced by an unnerving silence that appeared to press against his eardrums. In an attempt to find a clear channel, he tinkled with the dial until he came across something that chilled him to the bone. Initially, the sound was reminiscent of children singing, a gentle, eerie tune that seemed to float over the static like voices from another planet. Tommy, however, became increasingly aware that it wasn't singing as he listened more intently. It was in tears, children's voices all crying in perfect harmony. Tommy had to stop and see whether there were genuine children in his taxi since the sound was so terrible and lifelike. The sobbing lasted precisely 3 minutes before coming to an abrupt halt. Silence was worse than what came next. The sound was that of breathing. Despite Tommy's heater being on full blast, his slow, deliberate breaths seemed to fog up his windshield from the inside. A visible cloud of condensation formed with each exhale, spelling words. The words, "Help us," flashed on the passenger side window before disappearing. To record what was happening, Tommy reached for his phone, but it was dead. Not dead, low battery, as though something had used up all of power from it immediately. His cab's temperature plummeted so quickly that he could see his own breath blending with the enigmatic condensation on the windows, and his dashboard electronics started to flicker. The radio's breathing sounds became more intense and louder. Tommy heard what sounded like scratching coming from inside his speakers, like fingernails tearing at them. Then came the murmurs. A terrible chorus of pleas was produced by dozens of little voices speaking simultaneously. Don't abandon us. It's freezing. We are unable to locate our home. Kindly, sir, please assist us. Tommy was so frantic to change the frequency and stop the radio that his hands trembled as he went for the dial. However, the voices followed him regardless of the channel he chose. Somehow they were ingrained in his radio system, becoming more powerful and distinct every minute. The kids talked of becoming lost in the snow and being stuck in a place that was constantly winter, dark, and cold. A young girl who couldn't have been older than 7 years old started talking to Tommy directly. She was aware of his name, that he drove a truck, and that he was by himself on the freeway. She told him of the others, dozens of youngsters who had gotten lost in blizzards throughout the years, whose bodies were never located, who were still roaming in a long winter in search of unanswered aid. In Tommy's cab, the temperature kept decreasing. On the inside of his windows, ice started to build, producing complex designs that uncannily resembled small handprints. He exhaled invisible puffs that hung in the air longer than they should have, producing little face-like figures before vanishing. The young girl's voice then shifted, become frightened and urgent. There was more in the static between them, she said, Tommy. Something that pursued the missing kids. Something that fueled their panic and anxiety. Before the radio noticed him, she pleaded with him to switch it off. Before it became aware that someone was actually listening to their frequency. But Tommy couldn't move. He was drawn more into their frozen world by the mesmerizing whispers. Through his frosted windshield, he could practically see them. Tiny people trudging amid unending mounds of snow. The cold blasted from their lips. A terrible sense of despondency was reflected in their eyes. With fingertips that resembled icicles, they groped for his truck, begging for warmth, for help, for someone to notice them. The radio began to scratch violently, as though something with claws was attempting to rip itself from the speakers. The children's cries turned into terrified screams, alerting Tommy to the fact that the hunter had located them and was pursuing him as well. The ice started to form on his windows, spiderweb patterns that fracture. Tommy could swear he saw bright eyes observing him from the storm outside through the fissures. The engine of his pickup died out of the blue. The lights all went out. The wind roaring and the frightened wailing of phantom children were the only sounds. Tommy felt the temperature drop even further in the complete darkness of his taxi. His cheeks, toes, and fingertips all became numb. He was stuck in an unimaginable cold that existed between radio frequencies, freezing to death in his own truck. The little girl's voice, no more than a whisper, broke through the confusion one last time. Don't allow it to get to you. Switch off the radio. Save yourself. Tommy grabbed the CB radio with all of his remaining strength and tore the power. Cable off of it. Socket. Everything ceased when the link was lost. The temperature returned to normal quickly. He roared back to life with his engine. His dispatcher asked him why he hadn't checked in as his phone flashed on, displaying scores of missed calls. Tommy sped through to Kansas City without pausing. However, the encounter had fundamentally altered him. The sound of those kids' voices kept coming back to him. He was unable to forget the sensation of unnatural cold that had almost killed him. Worse, he started looking into incidents of missing children along his typical paths and found a terrible trend. In the Midwest, winter storms have claimed the lives of over 30 children in the last 50 years. Their remains were never found. Eventually, their cases were closed, leaving their families with nothing but sorrow and unanswered questions. The disappearances invariably occurred during the greatest blizzards, when rescue attempts were difficult and visibility was at nil. In order to study the faces of missing children whose cases went back decades, Tommy began keeping copies of missing person flyers in his taxi. His CB radio would occasionally crackle with static, and he would hear the echoes of familiar voices on deserted highways late at night. The same kids who had talked to him that frightful Missouri night. Never again did he tune to that frequency. He didn't have to, though. Even so, the voices reached him, whispering through his radio in the deadliest hours of the night, reminding him that scores of lost souls were still calling for aid that would never arrive somewhere in the static between stations, stuck in an endless winter. Even though Tommy stopped working long-distance trucking 6 months later, He still gets up in the middle of the night occasionally, hears kids sobbing, and feels ice crystals accumulating on the windows of his bedroom. He is aware the frequency remains on, awaiting the next lonesome motorist to discover it amid a winter storm. And he is aware that those lost kids may eventually manage to entice someone else into their icy realm, where the cold never goes away and the snow never stops falling. From Sacramento to Reno, Danny Walsh believed he knew every inch of Interstate 80. For 8 years, he had been transporting vegetables from the Central Valley of California to the casinos and dining establishments in Nevada twice a week. He knew the freeway as well as his own driveway. Every bend, slope, every mile sign that separates the desert from the Pacific shore. He was therefore deeply shaken by what transpired on a misty October night in 2020. It began as Danny was climbing through the Sierra at around 2 a.m. Mountains in Nevada. There was only around 20 feet of vision in front of his headlights due to a dense fog that had swept in. It was the type of soup that caused seasoned drivers to slow down to a crawl and hope they didn't hit someone who had stopped in the street. At around 25, Danny was creeping along with his hazard lights blazing when he noticed the mile marker. Mile 187. The issue was that this section of I-80 did not have mile 187. Danny was well versed in the system of numbers. Just before the Cisco Grove exit was mile 186. Additionally, the Soda Springs turnoff was close to mile 188. Mile 187 did not exist. There had never been a mile 187, but there it was, standing precisely where it shouldn't have been, gleaming white in his headlights. Squinting through the fog to make sure he wasn't seeing things, Danny slowed down even further. The sign has the same appearance as all the other freeway mile markers. The reflective coating, white text, and green background were all the same, yet it indicated a mile that could not be real. Something changed when Danny crossed the impossible marker. Around his truck, the fog appeared to get thicker until his headlights could hardly see 5 feet in front of them. It sounded muffled and far away, as though he were driving underwater, the usual sounds of the highway, the rumble of his diesel engine, and the thud of his tires on asphalt. Then he caught sight of the hitchhiker. In the swirling fog, a person stood on the shoulder, thumb out, utterly still. As he went by, Danny's beam swept across the individual, but there was no way to discern any details due to the fog. A hazy human form that appeared to absorb light instead of reflect it. Danny had seen many hitchhikers in her 8 years of night driving, but none who waited by the side of the road so motionless as a statue. He observed another one a quarter of a mile later. The same position, the same strange motionlessness, the same ability to absorb light. Then one more, and one more. Before long, Danny was passing hitchhikers every few hundred yards. They were all the same in their still position and equally undetectable, save for their simple human figures. The fog started to manipulate perspective and distance. After reaching the impossibly high mile 187, Danny felt as though he had been driving for hours, but his odometer indicated that he had just traveled 3 miles. The road appeared to go on forever. With every turn, more fog, more hitchhikers, and more unreal geography are revealed. His CB. The radio went dead after crackling with static. The screen on his GPS was blank and read, "Location not found." The built-in navigation system on his truck appeared perplexed as well, showing question marks in place of the highway number. It appeared as though he had driven into an area that lay between the official mile markers, off the border of the known globe. The cabbies started to shift. As Danny passed, they began to turn their heads to follow his truck rather than remain still. Through the fog, he was unable to see their faces, but he could sense their focus on him like icy fingers against his back. As his headlights drew closer, a few of them moved toward the road, perhaps debating whether to walk straight into his path. Danny attempted to radio for assistance, alternating between emergency and CB frequencies, but each channel yielded the same outcome. Only sporadic bursts of static, which sounded unsettlingly like muttered whispers, broke the dead silence. The brr tone was definitely urgent, as though dozens of people were attempting to warn him of something dreadful coming. But the words were too garbled to make sense. He saw mile 187, 5 in his headlights. Next, mile 187. Then, at mile 187.9, Danny became increasingly horrified to see that he was confined to a single mile of highway that had somehow been extended into an interminable loop. It seemed as though distance itself had become odd and stretchy as the mile signs were ticking up in fractions. They were getting hitched, more audacious. Danny had to swerve past several of them because they were now standing right on the middle line. Despite the speed of his truck, others strolled beside it, keeping up. Over the sound of the engines, their footsteps could be heard somehow. Danny noticed them trailing after his trailer when he checked his mirrors, an increasing line of dark shapes that came out of and vanished back into the mist. There were hundreds of them by mile 187.9. They faced Dye's truck and were completely silent as they lined both sides of the roadway like parade-goers. Danny had to rely solely on the reflective lane markers, which appeared to glow with their own internal light, to navigate the road surface because the fog had grown so dense. Then he spotted mile 100, the actual mile 888, which was precisely where every map and GPS device in the world indicated it should be. Just like a curtain being drawn back, the fog abruptly lifted as Danny's headlights struck the well-known marking. In an instant, the hitchhikers disappeared, leaving no evidence of their presence. His radio came back to life with the usual buzz of the roadway. His precise location on I-80 between Cisco Grove and Soda Springs was displayed when his GPS revived. After pulling into the next truck stop, Danny checked his watch, odometer, and logbooks for 20 minutes. Every instrument in his truck indicated that he had traveled precisely 1 mile between markers 187 and 188. The journey had lasted exactly 2 minutes and 37 seconds, which is typical for that amount of roadway at a slower pace. However, Danny was aware that he had encountered an impossibility. He had been stranded in a mile of road that was technically non-existent for what seemed like hours, encircled by people who shouldn't be there. It felt unnatural to drive through such dense fog. When he went home, he did some research on the region, searching for historical oddities, accidents, or disappearances that could account for what he had gone through. More than the event itself, what he discovered chilled him. On the particular section of I-80, 7 drivers had experienced similar events in the previous 30 years. Every time in dense fog, with improbable mile signs and enigmatic hitchhikers, it lasted precisely 1 mile before heading back home typical roadway. 3 of the drivers were completely gone. Their trucks were discovered with their engines, still running at rest areas or truck stops. According to logbooks, they had just stopped in the middle of their journey for no apparent reason. As though they had left their lives behind and disappeared into the mists, the drivers were never seen again. Danny continues to drive I-80, but when the weather forecast predicts fog in the mountains, he takes a different route. Late at night, he has overheard other truckers discussing mile 187 on the CB radio. There have been tales of vehicles becoming lost between the markers, picking up non-human hitchhikers, and finding themselves stuck on the same mile again and over again until they either escaped or joined whatever was haunting that unreachable section of the highway. Danny occasionally believes he can still make out the stars in his peripheral vision on clear nights when they are brilliant and the road is deserted. There are figures on the side of the road with their thumbs out, anxiously waiting for the next motorist to become disoriented in the fog and find the mile marker that appears just when you need it most but isn't marked on any official map. Over the course of his 15-year career, Jake Morrison had driven into thousands of truck stops. Transporting cargo across the Sunset Ridge Travel Plaza was unlike any he had ever seen in the country. Around 3 a.m. on a moonless night in rural Nebraska, it came into view in his headlights. It was a vast complex of parking lots, petrol pumps, and a main building that seemed much too big for such a barren section of Interstate 80. Jake was initially taken aback by how flawless everything appeared. The majority of truck stops displayed their age. Weeds sprouting through the asphalt, neon signs that flicker, and cracked pavement. Sunset Ridge, however, seems to have been constructed just yesterday. The parking area was immaculate. The facade of the structure was illuminated by strategically placed floodlights. And even the fuel pumps, with their throwback 1980s style, looked brand new. Jake parked his trailer into an empty parking spot next to the building so he could get some gasoline and take a restroom break. Then he saw something strange. There were no other cars in sight, even though the truck stop was spotless and well lit. No trucks, no automobiles, no under those two brilliant lights. Motorbikes, nothing but emptiness stretching in every direction. As Jake got closer, the glass doors of the main structure opened automatically, setting out a happy electronic chime. His complexion appeared pale and sickly as fluorescent lights pulsed overhead, illuminating everything in a harsh white glow. It was a standard arrangement. There are game machines, a hot food counter, rows of snacks and beverages, and a tiny dining area with plastic tables and chairs. However, there was a problem with the product. As he scanned the shelves in the snack aisle, Jake saw that although everything appeared regular from a distance, the details were all incorrect. Although the candy bar's brand names were well known, the typography was a little strange. Kit Kat with 2 T's and the sneakers in place of Snickers. The logos on the soda cans were quite similar to those of Pepsi and Coca-Cola. A clerk at the counter grinned too broadly when Jake walked up to him. Despite the late hour, the man's uniform appeared pressed and starched, and his gray hair was neatly combed, giving the impression that he was in his 50s. His eyes were all dark, yet his name tag said Harold in friendly letters. The whole viewable area, not just the pupils, as if peering into 2 shadowy wells. Harold said, "Welcome to Sunset Ridge," in a voice that seemed to be emanating from a very deep hole. "What can I get for you tonight?" Jake muttered that he needed to buy some coffee and use the restroom. Harold gestured toward a hallway at the rear of the store, his smile never faltering. "Past the arcade, down the corridor, are the restrooms. The coffee is freshly prepared for you." The hallway extended back much beyond what the building's outside proportions permitted, making it longer than it should have been. There were ancient pictures in inexpensive frames. Truck drivers, families, and tourists are shown grinning for the camera. However, Jake sensed something unsettling about the individuals in the pictures as he passed them. Like Harold's, their eyes were wrong, utterly dark, reflecting the fluorescent lights in the hallway like mirrors that are dark. The bathroom was so sterile that it was practically surgical. In an attempt to get rid of the eerie feeling that had descended upon him since entering the facility, Jake splashed water on his face and peered in the mirror. He could see the bathroom door behind him in the reflection. He briefly believed that Harold was right there observing him. However, there was nobody in the doorway as Jake turned around. Harold was back in the main store, waiting with that same eerie smile and a warm cup of coffee. Jake's mouth watered at the amazing aroma of the coffee, which was rich and fragrant. When their hands momentarily met during the transaction, he noticed that Harold's fingers were unusually chilly, but he paid with cash despite his mounting discomfort. Harold remarked, "Drive safely now," as Jake made his way to the door. "And never forget that Sunset Ridge is always available to help. Always waiting, always open." Eager to get some distance from the strange truck stop, Jake got back into his vehicle and drove out from the parking area. However, he became aware that he couldn't recall the precise location of the exit when he turned back onto the freeway. He looked at his phone's truck stop directory, checked his GPS, and even retrieved local satellite maps. Nowhere along this section of I-80 was Sunset Ridge Travel Plaza. Jake took his required rest break in Iowa 3 hours later when he pulled into a real truck stop. He told another driver about Sunset Ridge, describing the 2 ideal facilities and the odd clerk. Carl, the other driver, who was older, became pale. "You went inside?" Carl's question was hardly audible above a whisper. "Jesus, son, you're lucky to be alive." Carl informed Jake about the rumors that went around among long-distance drivers. In the darkest hours of the night, CB radio whispered talks, tales of truck stops that popped up when drivers were lost, tired, or in a dire situation. Locations that were completely different from what they appeared to be on the outside. Something that ate travelers who paused to get gasoline, food, or get some rest. Carl claims that drivers who lingered at these imaginary truck stops for too long were never seen again. On isolated highways, their trucks would be discovered deserted, with their gasoline tanks empty and logbooks displaying improbable mileage figures. Security cameras at actual truck stops occasionally captured film of missing drivers following black-eyed clerks into buildings that were larger inside than outside, and missing drivers entering facilities that did not exist. "The coffee," answered Carl hurriedly. "Please tell me you didn't drink the coffee." Jake's blood became frozen. During his drive to Iowa, he had consumed almost the whole cup of coffee. He emptied it mindlessly because it was the most delicious coffee he had ever tasted. Hours later, he became aware that he felt odd. It's strange, but not exactly sick. Apollo felt as though nothingness had taken the place of something that had been scooped out of him. In the weeks that followed, Jake made an effort to resume his regular schedule. However, the experience at Sunset Ridge had altered him in ways he was unable to describe. Food didn't taste well. There was no rest in sleep. He was always hungry, but no matter how much he ate, he was never able to sate the yearning. The worst part was that he had to look for the truck stop on every night run, looking for that ideal parking space and those two bright lights on the horizon. Drivers started to steer clear of Jake. They claimed he appeared off in some way. Paler despite spending his days in the sun, slimmer despite eating continuously, and his eyes had taken on an odd appearance that unnerved people. Jake recognized their terror when he saw his image in the truck stop mirrors. It seemed as though something was gradually eating away at the edges of his eyes, making them darker. Every night the yearning got stronger. In order to reach a truck stop that existed somewhere between the official highway maps and the shadowy areas that hungry things called home, Jake would frequently find himself taking detours along unknown roads and following vaguely remembered exit signs. Sunset Ridge was calling to him now, so he knew he would locate it when he eventually found it again. Harold would be ready with another cup of exquisite coffee and that big smile. 3 months later, Jake's truck was discovered on a desolate section of the Nebraska highway. Despite being filled only hours before, the fuel tank is inexplicably empty and the engine is still running. He had traveled 847 miles that night, according to his logbook, but according to his GPS, he had never left the truck stop where he had begun his shift. Security cameras saw Jake entering what looked to be a truck stop, a brightly lit structure, pursuing a man in a tense uniform in the direction of a coffee stand illuminated by fluorescent lights that resembled an altar. 60 seconds later, the skyscraper disappeared from the video, leaving behind Jake's abandoned truck's distant glow and an empty highway. Even so, drivers continue to claim seeing Sunset Ridge on moonless evenings when the highway seems to go on forever. The fuel gauge is empty, and the urge for coffee is too great to ignore. They observe the two bright lights, the immaculate parking lot, and Harold waiting patiently behind the counter, his black eyes and impossible smile, awaiting the next driver to stop. Just a little while, just a cup of coffee, just long enough to feed the creature that inhabits the gaps between actual locations and creates truck stops when hungry drivers most need them. Rick Martinez had been a truck driver for 20 years, hauling everything: furnishings, electronics, animals, even dangerous substances that needed particular routing and licenses. However, on a chilly March night in 2021, he picked up goods from an unremarkable facility in Detroit that was unlike anything he had ever hauled. It was simply identified on the shipment manifest as medical equipment headed to an Atlanta research institution. The fact that the equipment was still in use was not mentioned. The facility was located in an industrial district that appeared deserted even in the daytime. The sole sound was the distant rumbling of interstate traffic, and strange shadows were thrown between deserted buildings by broken streetlights. Rick parked his trailer up to the loading dock, where a single, huge crate and two guys wearing rubber gloves and surgical masks were waiting. Easily 8 feet long, 4 feet broad, and 3 feet deep, the crate was enormous. It was constructed of sturdy steel, had several caution labels emblazoned on it, and reinforced corners. This side up, fragile, only to be transported in a refrigerator, and most dangerously, never open. Before Rick could raise any questions, the men silently locked it in his trailer, gave him the paperwork, and vanished back into the warehouse. Rick saw that his trailer felt heavier than normal as he backed away from the loading dock, even though it was only carrying a single crate. The weight distribution appeared strange, as though the cargo was changing back there, and his truck strained to accelerate. However, he noticed that the crate was securely fastened with sturdy straps and had not moved when he looked in his mirrors. About an hour into the drive, the first indication that something was amiss appeared. Rick was traveling south on I-75 when he heard a startling noise coming from his trailer. Like fingernails dragging over metal, there was a faint scratching sound. At the next rest stop, he stopped and went around to inspect his load, but everything appeared to be in order. Straps taut, warning labels still securely affixed. The carton sat just where the warehouse staff had placed it. Rick attempted to tell himself back in his cab that it was only the sounds of a truck getting used to the rhythm of the roadway. However, the scratching became louder and more persistent as the miles passed. A pattern emerged. After 3 brief scrapes, there was a break, followed by 3 additional scratches, similar to someone inside the container hammering out a distress signal. Something terrible joined the clawing about midnight. Whispers. Rick initially assumed it was simply the wind blowing through the openings in his trailer doors. However, he was able to discern true words when he switched off his radio and paid attention. Voices that sounded muffled and spoke in many languages, all speaking simultaneously, producing an unsettling chorus of requests and cautions that appeared to come from the steel crate. Rick called the number on his shipping manifest as he stopped into a truck stop outside of Cincinnati. The connection was cut off. He made use of the backup contact. One more dead number. He even checked up the address of the Atlanta Research Center online and found it to be a fake. He was transporting an unidentified load for an apparently non-existent corporation to an imaginary location. The trailer's voices became louder. Rick could hear them plainly now through the back wall of the cab as he sat in the truck stop parking lot trying to think of what to do. Dozens of voices in anxious, terrified tones. Some spoke English, describing an endless darkness, begging for assistance, and requesting to be released. There were others who spoke languages Rick didn't recognize, but there was a unifying anguish in their voices. A young woman with a southern accent that made Rick think of his own daughter broke through the confusion with a single voice. She pleaded with him to open the crate and explained that she had been imprisoned inside for so long that she had forgotten what sunshine looked like. She recounted being abducted from a hospital, being informed that she was a participant in a medical study, and waking up in total darkness with other people who had been duped in a similar way. Rick pondered his options, his hands shaking. He felt compelled to call the police. What would he tell them, though? That he could hear voices coming from inside a locked medical container, that his cargo was speaking to him. They would assume he was experiencing a breakdown or that he was hallucinating from too much travel. The voices grew increasingly forceful as the night went on. Rick was informed of the other people that attempted to take them. Drivers who had left hearing the incessant cries for assistance drove them crazy. When they finally opened the container, they discovered something much worse than they had anticipated. The voices informed him of the research center, detailed unethical tests, and described methods that left people conscious but unable to move or scream. Rick's heater was operating at full capacity, yet the temperature inside his cab started to decrease. On his windows, frost developed in patterns that resembled handprints on glass, which was unsettling. It seemed as though whatever was keeping them from the outside world was eroding as the voices became more vivid and clear. Individual stories were now audible to Rick. One of the construction workers had been involved in an accident. A homeless woman who believed she was receiving free medical care. A college student who had offered to participate in what appeared to be a standard study. By daybreak, Rick was at his breaking point. All night long, the voices had been speaking to him, identifying themselves, sharing their tales, and pleading with him to release them from whatever nightmare they had been imprisoned in. Determined to find out what was actually inside the crate, he pulled into an abandoned truck stop and used a crowbar to walk back to his trailer. Although the lock was sturdy, it was quickly dispatched by Rick's crowbar. The voices ceased abruptly as the steel lid groaned open. The only sound in the trailer was Rick's own frightened breathing, and then there was total quiet. A thick coating of dry ice formed within the crate, obscuring his eyesight with clouds of mist. When the fog dissipated, what appeared to be medical equipment caught Rick's eye. Cables, tubes, life support systems, and monitoring equipment. However, the apparatus was linked to something that sent shivers down Rick's spine. Dozens of human figures, suspended in a preservation fluid of some sort. They were unaware that their bodies were linked to technology that kept them alive. Their limbs were arranged as though they had been attempting to claw their way out when the preservation process started. Their eyes were wide but vacant, and their lips were locked in wordless cries. With shaking hands, Rick secured the crate and slammed it shut as he staggered backward. He could still hear them, though. Something else, not the preserved bodies. Something that had been speaking to him with their voices, in order to trick him into opening their prison. Whatever intellect was within that container had been posing as the victims and imitating their cries for assistance. That's when the genuine voices began. Unnatural noises that appeared to originate from the gaps between the bodies, claiming to show Rick things that would help him comprehend and make him want to join them in their preserved paradise. They were hungry whispers. Despite its weight, the crate started to swing back and forth, the straps straining against something that was attempting to escape from within. Talking about voices in his trailer and unlawful medical experiments, Rick drove straight to the closest police station and surrendered himself in. The officers discovered just what the manifest had promised when they opened the package: transporting real medical equipment to an Atlanta research facility, heart monitors, brain scanners, and surgery instruments, all of which are appropriately recorded and tracked. However, Rick was aware of what he had heard and seen. In whatever mental hospital he is currently staying in, the voices continue to whisper to him occasionally late at night when he is attempting to fall asleep. They inform him about the other people who are out there being carried in identical cages while they cry out for unanswered help. They tell him that he had the opportunity to join them, to find solace in their preserved gloom, to halted the awful burden of consciousness that accompanies awareness in life. Similar occurrences are also being reported by other truckers. Shipments that appear to have a conscience of their own, loads that mutter, and freight that begs for liberation. The majority of drivers learn to ignore the noises coming from their trailers and turn up their radios. However, some people are unable to ignore the whispers and cannot stop themselves from looking at what they are actually carrying through the night. They find their trucks abandoned on isolated highways. Except for typical cargo and the lingering odor of preservative chemicals, trailers are empty. The voices are still there, moving around the highways in unmarked containers, calling to drivers who are inquisitive enough to listen, lonely enough, or exhausted enough. They guarantee answers to questions you were unaware of, provide glimmers of a world outside the realm of everyday human existence. Simply open the package to see what's actually inside. You just need to pay attention, as the cargo begins to respond in whispers. In his 18 years as a truck mirror adjuster, Bobby Fletcher had never experienced anything like what transpired during his November 2019 voyage from Portland to Phoenix. At a dubious truck repair shop south of Bakersfield, it began with a straightforward side mirror replacement. The kind of store that didn't ask too many questions about how you paid for them or where you obtained your parts, and that remained open all night. Bobby was anxious on busy highways since the previous mirror had been bouncing free for weeks, causing blind spots. At midnight auto repair, he noticed. Despite the late hour, he drew in, gleaming under flickering neon signs. He was met by the mechanic, a thin, oily man with yellowed teeth who called himself Pete. He promised to get Bobby back on the road in an hour and gave a reasonable cost for the mirror replacement. In the intense glare of floodlights, Pete worked swiftly to remove Bobby's damaged mirror and install what appeared to be a regular replacement. However, as soon as Bobby got back into his taxi and adjusted the new mirror, he saw that something was off. The reflection was too crisp and clear, revealing details that shouldn't have been visible in the dim parking lot of the repair shop. Bobby observed that the mirror appeared to reflect more than it should when he turned back onto Highway 99. The new mirror showed things that weren't there or shouldn't have been there, while his other mirrors displayed the expected image of his trailer and the road behind him. In shadows where there should be no movement, he saw glimmers of movement. Almost human-looking forms that moved in ways that defied physics were seen darting between other cars. Bobby initially persuaded himself that it was simply the trickery of his weary eyes, Bobby had been driving for 14 hours straight, and long haul. Truckers were known to experience hallucinations after excessive driving. However, the images in the mirror became unavoidable as the night went on. Bobby started to see what was going on inside other cars in the mirror. The automobile was moving at perfect speed and staying in its lane, but when he passed a sedan on a dark stretch of highway, the driver was slumped over the steering wheel, blood flowing from a head wound, visible in the mirror. When Bobby turned to face the car with his own eyes, the driver looked healthy, awake, and completely normal. He saw a family in an SUV in the mirror a few miles later. Bobby saw them screaming in fear, their jaws agape, their eyes reflecting some horrible horror, rather than the typical scene of parents and kids on a road trip. But if he looked straight at the SUV, he could see through the windows that the family was sleeping soundly, the kids contentedly in their car seats. The hidden reality that existed in parallel to the everyday world was being revealed to Bobby by the mirror. Every car he drove by had horrors, tragedies, or secrets that were hidden from view, but were glaringly obvious in the damned reflection. When Bobby checked his own trailer in the mirror, the worst realization occurred. Rather than seeing his furniture, cargo, and appliances, he saw dozens of pallid individuals clinging to his truck's exterior in the mirror, like someone who had attempted to twist clay into human form without knowing the correct proportions. They had extended limbs and faces that were nearly human but stretched incorrectly. Their jaws twitched continuously as though they were attempting to convey an urgent message, and their eyes were pure black. Bobby stopped at the next rest spot, grabbing a flashlight and walking around his trailer with trembling hands. Everything appeared to be typical. His usual freight load was fastened with ties and regulation straps. There were no figures or irregularities. However, the pale figures were still there, still hanging to his vehicle, still trying to communicate with him through their silent words. As he went back to his cab and looked in the mirror, the images in the mirror grew increasingly agitated as the night wore on. They appeared to be alerting Bobby of an impending danger as they hurriedly motioned at other cars, as though they were attempting to get him ready for some horrible incident that only they could see coming. Their movements and wordless cries grew increasingly desperate. Bobby started seeing glimmers of the future in the mirror. He witnessed emergency vehicles with flashing lights, his own truck being jackknifed over several highway lanes, and body bags being loaded into ambulances. The pictures were short, but incredibly detailed. Even the precise location of the sun in the sky, along with identifiable landmarks and mile markers, suggested that these events would take place at dawn. Bobby attempted to cover the mirror with a towel, but he was still able to see through the cloth as though it were made of transparent material. No matter how many times he tried to move the mirror to point away from the road, it kept going, back to its previous position. The damned mirror had grown obsessed with revealing to him things he didn't want to see, facts he wasn't supposed to be aware of. When Bobby got closer to the precise spot he'd seen in his future visions, the pale beings became increasingly agitated. They made frantic motions, pointed forward, and shoved their faces against what appeared to be an imperceptible wall between both his and the globe. Bobby could see in the mirror that the highway ahead was strewn with debris, twisted metal, strewn about cargo and emergency personnel who moved in slow, methodical steps, as if they were handling a large number of casualties. However, everything seemed normal when Bobby glanced at the same section of road through his windshield. Traffic moved well in the early morning. There were no indications of a collision, and the pavement was clear. The mirror was presenting him a disaster that was somehow coming with unavoidable certainty, an event that had not yet occurred. Bobby's CB only generated static when he attempted to radio other truckers to alert them to possible dangers up ahead. Even though he was in an area with typically good coverage, his phone did not display any signal when he tried to call 911 to report a potential accident. More feverishly, the pale creatures in the mirror pointed at his steering wheel, as though to compel him to do anything. Bobby became aware of the terrible reality as morning drew near. He was seeing more than simply the future in the mirror. It was showing him his involvement in making it. In the next several minutes, he would make decisions that would lead to the accident he had witnessed. He wasn't being warned about someone else's tragedy by the pale figures. They were attempting to keep him from becoming the reason behind it. As other cars drove past, Bobby parked his pickup on the shoulder and sat there. Their drivers were not aware of the impending disaster. He looked at himself in the mirror, could observe the pallid figures nodding in agreement, their agitated motions subsiding in response to kind words of support. Bobby had somehow altered the destiny the mirror had depicted for him by refusing to move on and play his part in the predestined disaster. But he was not the only victim of the mirror's curse. The reflection started to show Bobby different futures, other catastrophes he might cause or stop, while he sat on the highway shoulder. He imagined that he would be driving through a school zone, just as kids would be crossing the roadway. He witnessed the brake on his truck fail, setting off a series of events that would result in the deaths of scores of people. He witnessed every calamity that might arise from his continuous presence on the highway. That morning, after 18 years of truck driving, Bobby left his vehicle and never looked back. 3 days later, the highway patrol located the car. The driver is nowhere to be seen, but the cargo is undamaged and the engine is still going. The replacement mirror had been taken out, leaving no evidence that it had ever been there. Other truck drivers have had experiences with Pete's Midnight Auto Repair, which is consistently located in various areas and consistently provides affordable, speedy repairs. Those who agree to have his mirrors replaced discover oneself experiencing futures that have not yet been but may, and seeing objects that exist in the liminal zones between reality and reflection, learning that some information has an unpayable cost and that some facts are too horrible to endure. Across the highway system, the mirrors are still mounted on vehicles, giving drivers a view of parallel worlds to our own. The majority of truck drivers learn to ignore the damned reflections, concentrate on the road ahead, and only believe what they can see it with their own eyes. However, some people are unable to quit searching for the truth that lies under the surface of everyday reality. Pale figures cling to the outside of automobiles. The future is written in visions too terrible to ignore, and their trucks are discovered abandoned on distant highways with mirrors missing and drivers gone into whatever reality lurks on the other side of reflection. After 12 years of transporting machinery throughout the Midwest, Dave Kowalski believed he knew every way station between Chicago and Denver. Scales from the Department of Transportation were only one aspect of the work. Routine halts, at which authorities weighed you, looked through your logbooks, and examined your equipment before allowing you to resume driving. This is why Dave's understanding of the traffic laws was completely upended by what transpired near mile marker 247 on Interstate 80 in Iowa. Around 2 a.m., the way station came into view in his headlights. On a misty October evening in 2020, despite the bad visibility, Dave managed to stay ahead of time while transporting a shipment of industrial equipment from Chicago to Colorado. "All trucks must enter," was displayed on the electronic sign. In the recognizable orange letters, Dave moved down and maneuvered his rig onto the scale platform. However, there was an instant issue with this way station. Dave had never seen a DOT building that appeared to be decades older. It had a chimney that spewed black smoke into the night sky, old brick walls, and small windows with bars across them. The scale itself was enormous, much bigger, featuring odd symbols etched along the sides of the concrete platform, more than was required for weighing trucks. Out of the structure came a figure dressed in what appeared to be a DOT uniform, but the clothes were outdated, as though they had been made in the 1950s. The tall, thin inspector had pale skin and eyes that gleamed like an animal in the floodlights of the station. Inspector Morrison was written on his name tag, but every time Dave tried to concentrate on it, the letters appeared to move and become blurry. Morrison's voice echoed oddly, as though he were speaking from inside a deep hollow, and he said, "Evening, driver. Please exit your car so we can assess it. Tonight we must inspect more than just your cargo." With documents in hand, Dave hopped out of his taxi. However, Morrison had no interest in his lighting bills or logbooks. Rather, the inspector circled Dave's truck at a leisurely pace, tracing the surface of the trailer with his fingers and occasionally pushing his ear against the metal as though listening for anything within. Morrison checked a clipboard that appeared to be covered in text. Dave couldn't quite read and stated, Your cargo weight looks fine. We must measure something else, though. Please get on the platform. Morrison pointed to a narrow strip of the scale platform that had been painted white. Dave paused. No inspector had ever asked him to stand on the scales himself in his 12 years of trucking. But Morrison's pale eyes exuded a command that appeared to demand compliance. Dave then entered the assigned space. Incomprehensible figures flickered on the digital readout. Not pounds or tons, but odd figures that seemed to change and evolve while Dave watched. Dave could see no graphite touching the paper, but Morrison scowled and checked his clipboard, making notes with a pencil that left marks. Interesting, said Morrison softly. Your manifest shows that you are carrying more than that. A lot more. We will have to conduct a thorough examination. The way station building, which was much bigger inside than its exterior should have been, was where Morrison led Dave. The interior appeared to be a cross between an old-fashioned medical examination room and a government office, complete with filing cabinets stocked with manila papers, white-sheeted examination tables, and odd equipment that clicked and hummed in the darkness. Morrison pointed to a chair in front of what appeared to be a massive balance scale and said, "Please sit here." The traditional type where 2 plates are hung from a central beam. However, the left plate included items Dave couldn't reach, rather than weights on one side. Determine. Objects that changed color and appeared to absorb light instead of reflect it. Morrison started posing queries that were unrelated to trucking laws. He was curious about Dave's early years, romances, frustrations, and regrets. Morrison wrote additional notes on his enigmatic clipboard with each response, and the items on the scale appeared to get heavier, sinking that side of the balance lower. "Tell me about the accident in Milwaukee," Morrison said, uttered abruptly. Dave felt his blood freeze. It had been 8 years since the catastrophe. An inattentional moment. He would run a red light. Someone who happened to be in the crosswalk at the wrong time. No charges had ever been brought against Dave. Everything had been covered by the insurance. Additionally, the tragedy was formally categorized as inevitable. Dave, however, was aware of the reality. He had been too exhausted and preoccupied to meet the delivery date. "I'm not sure what Dave lied about what you're talking about." With a smile, Morrison flashed teeth that appeared much too sharp for human teeth. "Mr. Kowalski, the scale is honest. You're bearing the burden of that man's passing, the shame of never coming clean, and the guilt of the family you wrecked. That's a lot of weight for one vehicle to carry." Dave could see his reflection in the dark things on the left plate as the balancing scale tilted even more. His mirror, however, was off. He was older, more gaunt, and had hollow eyes that revealed sorrow and shame that he had spent years trying to hide. Without any of the stories he told himself about that night in Milwaukee, the picture captured him for what he truly was. Morrison persisted in questioning, asking about other situations Dave had attempted to forget. The time he almost struck a school bus while driving under the influence. When his truck broke down, he left the shipment of medication behind, knowing that sick patients would be left without their prescriptions. In order to falsify his logbooks, he had accepted bribes. He had misled about the safety inspections. He had disregarded the rules in order to save time and money. The scale tilted farther with each confession, and the shadowy items on the left plate appeared to become more substantial and genuine. They weren't objects, Dave realized. They were the tangible manifestation of all the bad decisions he had ever made, all the instances of cowardice and selfishness he had ever experienced. Morrison clarified, looking at his clipboard, "The issue is that you're overweight, much too heavy to continue. The roads. We will have to reduce your workload." Morrison took out a big folder with Dave's name from a filing cabinet. Photographs, papers, and what appeared to be medical records from Dave's early years were found within. However, there were also items on the pages that shouldn't have been there. Thought logs. Dave had never spoken anything out loud. He had attempted to repress those memories. He had experienced nightmares and dreams during the deepest hours of the night. "We provide a number of weight loss choices. We can erase certain memories," Morrison remarked. "For example, you might utterly forget about the accident. Or we can assign blame to another person, maybe a relative who has never committed a crime. Complete reorganization of the personality is the most preferred option. Your physique and trucking abilities are retained, but a cleaner, more effective model takes the place of everything else. It became increasingly clear to Dave that this was no ordinary way station. The moral weight of souls was measured and modified in some sort of supernatural processing center. The identities of thousands of drivers who had come through this facility were in the other files in Morrison's cabinet. They are all transporting loads that are too hefty on regular roads. What would happen if I said no? Dave inquired. Morrison smiled more broadly, flashing those impossible to sharp teeth. Your present burden will then continue to grow heavier as you carry it. With each mile you travel, each day you live, the consequences of your decisions will mount until they totally overwhelm you. The majority of drivers would rather use our services than that substitute. Dave gazed at the balance scale, seeing his image in those shadowy items that contained all of his accumulated shame and sorrow. He considered how relieved he would be to have everything taken away, to drive out of here with no regrets and no recollection of the suffering he had caused. However, a part of him objected to the proposition. He was a product of those memories, even the bad ones. He was a more cautious driver and a more thoughtful person as a result of his remorse and regret. Removing his errors would also remove the lessons they had imparted to him. Dave responded, "I'll keep my load." At last. Morrison appeared truly taken aback. "Are you sure? It will only get heavier. The burden increases each time you commit a new error, speak a falsehood, or do harm to another individual. It will eventually ruin you. After that, I'll need to watch what I put in it," Dave said. Morrison made a last note on his clipboard and shrugged. "All right, but keep in mind that we're always available if you decide to alter your mind, Mr. Kowalski. The weight keeps piling up and the scales never close." After making his way back to his vehicle, Dave got into the cab and left the way station. The facility was gone when he looked in his mirrors, leaving only an empty roadway in his wake. But Dave could feel the change in his pickup. It was truly heavier today, burdened by the full realization of all the mistakes he had made during his life. The weight never decreased. If anything, it got heavier as Dave became more conscious of the impact his decisions had on other people. However, he also improved as a person and a driver, bearing his burden with the understanding that some burdens are supposed to be carried rather than passed on to others. Similar way stations, which show up on vacant highway segments when drivers are transporting more than just merchandise in their trailers, have been encountered by other truckers. Some take Morrison up on his offer and leave feeling lighter, but strangely less. Some, like Dave, decide to keep their loads and deal with the fallout from their decisions. Drivers whose souls have become too heavy for regular highways to support still see the way station. Morrison keeps working, helping people who are unable to take responsibility for their own misdeeds. But eventually, the scale always balances. Additionally, the costs of the loads we decide to bear through the night are always borne by someone. By himself. When Marcus Williams purchased the used sleeper berth from a truck scrapyard outside of Memphis, he had already owned his Peterbilt 379 for 6 years. Before his next long-distance run to Seattle, Marcus needed a replacement berth because the original had been destroyed in a small accident. The unit was sold to him for half the customary amount by an anxious, twitchy-handed salvage yard owner who appeared eager to get it off his lot. With dark blue curtains, a firm mattress that exhibited little wear, and a regular size, the berth appeared to be in good shape. The proprietor of the salvage yard failed to disclose the origin of the berth or the reason for the prior owner's decision to tear it from his truck in the middle of the night and insist on its destruction. Within 12 hours, Marcus was back on the road after having the berth fitted at a Little Rock truck shop. It seemed absolutely normal for him to sleep in the new berth for the first time. After pulling into a rest spot north of Nashville, he pulled down the curtains and took his allotted 8-hour break. Long-haul truckers rarely got the kind of deep, sound sleep that this one provided. However, Marcus sensed something odd as he woke up. Although his truck's clock showed that 3 hours had passed, his logbook revealed he had been asleep for precisely 8 hours. Stranger still, his GPS indicated that he had inadvertently driven 47 miles while parked at the rest area. Marcus looked at his odometer and fuel gauge. Both attested to the fact that someone had driven his truck while he was asleep. Marcus initially thought there was a problem with the electronics in his truck. Clocks could be impacted by electrical issues, and GPS systems occasionally had glitches. However, the same thing occurred the following evening. When Marcus woke up after a nap at a truck stop in Wyoming, he discovered that his truck had inexplicably moved to a different parking lot, space that was facing the other way from the parking lot. Marcus was horrified by what he saw on the security cameras at the truck stop. According to the video, his pickup started up at 3 in the morning and drove itself around the parking lot for about an hour. The cameras recorded a scene via the windshield when the cab lights were on. Marcus had been asleep in his berth the whole time, but there was a stranger behind the steering wheel. Furthermore, the person operating his truck didn't appear to be very human. The shape's movements were incorrect, but it was around Marcus's size and form. Too precise, too fluid, like unseen strings controlling a puppet. The moment the subject faced the camera, it's with the exception of 2 dark holes where eyes should have been, the face was completely featureless and blank. Over the next few evenings, Marcus attempted to remain up, but fatigue finally compelled him to go to sleep. The same thing occurred each time he used the berth. When he would wake up from an abnormally deep slumber, he would discover that something that looked like him but wasn't him had driven his truck. It appeared to be learning, growing more self-assured every night, traveling more and farther from Marcus's parking spot. During the hours when Marcus should have been resting, other truckers started to describe odd experiences with his vehicle. They claimed to have seen his Peterbilt driven by a driver who waved but never answered CB radio calls on routes where Marcus had no recollection of ever traveling. According to some, the driver appeared to have attempted to mimic Marcus's looks in some way. From an underdeveloped photo, the corporation started making more ambitious travel plans. In one state, Marcus would go to sleep and wake up to discover that he had spent the night driving hundreds of miles. His fuel usage skyrocketed. Toll road cameras recorded his truck traveling in places Marcus had never been, and his tires displayed odd wear patterns. Even worse, during these nighttime excursions, the thing appeared to be communicating with humans. Strangers thanked Marcus on thank you cards for providing them with roadside assistance in the middle of the night. After a lunch, Marcus didn't remember having a waitress at a diner in Oklahoma called to congratulate him for the huge tip he had left. Employees at the gas station knew him from earlier visits that had never taken place. Using Marcus's truck and identity, the creature was leading a parallel existence and forming connections and experiences that Marcus would never recall. Something seemed to have learned to live inside his berth while he was slept, controlling his car and his appearance to explore the world in the hours when Marcus wasn't aware. Marcus attempted to sleep in a motel rather than his berth, but the thing appeared to be attached to the truck instead of him. His Peterbilt, departing parking lots in the middle of the night while being driven by the same faceless person, was caught on camera by hotel security. In order to animate his truck, the creature seemed to be getting stronger, more self-sufficient, and less reliant on Marcus's physical presence. Marcus's installation of a covert camera in his taxi, positioned to record the berth region while he slept, was the turning point. The something in the footage was inexplicable. A dark reflection of Marcus started to develop on the berth next to him as he slept. Initially translucent, resembling smoke molded into a human shape, the replica eventually hardened to resemble Marcus in every way. Then, as Marcus slept on, the duplicate would get out of the berth, turn on the truck, and drive off. What occurred to Marcus while his clone was gone, however, was the most terrible aspect. His body was captured on camera as it grew more translucent, eventually disappearing into the dark fabric of the delivery. It wasn't merely a clone of him. It was gradually taking his place, gaining material from his slumber to give it greater life. Marcus became aware that something that resided in the berth and fed on the life essence and dreams of whoever slept there was consuming him. Every night, his clone grew more substantial as he grew slightly less solid. The creature would eventually be finished, and Marcus would completely disappear. leaving just the clone to continue living his life and operating his truck. Marcus's investigation into the birth's past validated his worst suspicions. 3 months before to Marcus's purchase, the previous owner, Ray Sullivan, a truck driver, had inexplicably disappeared. The birth. At a rest stop, Ray's truck was discovered idle, the sleeper bed vacant, and there was no indication of the driver's whereabouts. Ray was seen on security film going into his berth for the night but never coming out. However, other film from the same era showed a man who looked just like Ray driving his truck across the nation. Eventually, the replica had given up the truck and vanished, using Ray's stolen identification, most likely to begin a new life. Because he suspected what had happened but was unable to prove it, the owner of the salvage yard had been frantic to sell the berth. Marcus made every effort to sever his relationship with the entity. He had a priest perform an exorcism, burned sage to purge negative energy, and bless the berth with holy water. Nothing was successful. Marcus could feel himself growing weaker, more translucent, and less attached to his own body as the creature grew stronger every night. Marcus's decision to remain awake and face the monster as it manifested was the last confrontation. His replica appeared on the bird, solid enough to create shadows in the gloom, and he watched in fear. The duplicate's eyes were pitch black when it opened them, as if it were gazing into dark wells that did not reflect any light. In Marcus's own words, the duplicate said, "You can't stop this." Years have passed while I waited in this birth, becoming stronger with every dreamer who fed me. You'll be nothing more than a memory that fades with the dawn, and soon I'll have enough substance to live on my own. Marcus's hands moved through the thing like smoke as he attempted to combat it. Marcus was already more ghost than man, too faded to affect the physical world. The copy said, laughing. Every night, the thing had been stealing fragments of Marcus's essence and utilizing them to construct a flawless substitute. 3 weeks later, Marcus's truck was discovered at a rest area in Montana, with the engine running and everything missing save for a faintly human-looking outline on the mattress. At truck stops across the nation, the new owner of Marcus's identity has been seen living Marcus's life to the fullest and entertaining other truckers with tales of adventures Marcus never had. The berth was once more sold to an unwary truck driver. And so the cycle goes on. The sleeper berth that just dreams is waiting for its next victim somewhere on America's highways, ready to slowly devour another driver's essence while they sleep, producing flawless replicas that depart with stolen lives, while the originals are reduced to mere impressions on a mattress where nightmares are born and dreams die, and dreams die. For 9 years, Leonard Hayes had been transporting auto parts across the desert on Interstate 10 between Tucson and El Paso. Between the two cities, he was familiar with every exit, rest area, and mile marker. Thus, on a moonless night in August 2021, at precisely 3:33 a.m., Leonard saw exit 66B in his headlights and realized that something was seriously wrong with the Earth. There was no map showing the exit. Leonard had researched DOT, GPS, and roadway atlases. There had never been an exit 66B on this section of I-10, and there had been construction reports for years. 65, 67, and 69 were the numbers of the standard exits. No 66 of any kind, much less a 66B, was present. However, it was there, conspicuously marked with the typical green highway signs, replete with reflective text that shone brightly in the dark and attracted his headlights. Pitchin Township, services available, was written in the exit signs, recognizable white letters on green backdrop, which were used to identify all interstate off-ramps in the United States. However, Leonard was unaware about Pitchin Township. Additionally, his charts showed that for 50 meters in all directions, this area of desert was made up entirely of barren terrain. According to Leonard's fuel gauge, he had an abundance of diesel to get to El Paso, and he was on track, according to his logbook. It made little sense to take an unmarked exit that led to a non-existent town. However, there was something about the sign that made him slow down, turn right, and steer his 18-wheeler down the off-ramp into whatever was beyond the familiar glow of the interstate. Longer than necessary, The exit ramp descended slowly into a darkness that appeared thicker than usual at night. Leonard's headlights only reached a few yards in front of him, as though the light was being absorbed by the blackness itself. It also felt odd on the pavement beneath his wheels. It seemed older and rougher, as though it had been constructed decades before the current interstate system. Leonard discovered a stop sign at the bottom of the ramp that appeared to have been hand-painted rather than manufactured. There was a two-lane road beyond it that vanished into a total blackness that appeared solid. Apart from a dilapidated wooden sign that stated Dishon Township, population 0 in faded white paint, there were no building lights, no street lights, and no other indications of civilization. It would have been better for Leonard to turn around at that point, go back on the highway, and act as though he had never noticed the impossibly difficult exit. However, truck drivers are always inquisitive, and the mystery of this obscure hamlet drew him in like in his mind, a fishing line hooked. He put the car in first gear and rolled into the night. The paved road through Dishon Township had cracks and weeds were sprouting in almost intentional patterns through the asphalt. Buildings on both sides of the street were visible via Leonard's headlights, stores, residences, a gas station, even a tiny church that appeared to have a twisted steeple. However, all of the buildings had been deserted, dark and black for so long that nature had started to take them back. Despite the obvious abandonment, everything appeared so well preserved that it made Leonard's skin crawl. There were no indications of structural collapse, fire damage, or vandalism on the buildings. Despite the eerie silence that suggested no one had lived here for years, the paint looked new, the windows were unbroken, and the doors hung straight on their hinges. After parking his vehicle in front of what looked like a general store, Leonard got out of his cab. There was complete quiet. No insects, no breeze, and no distant interstate traffic noises. His footfall also sounded muffled, as though the air itself was too dense to transmit sound clearly. The front door of the general shop was unlocked. Leonard discovered shelves filled with items that, while initially appearing normal, turned out to be incorrect. The brand labels on canned foods were familiar, if slightly different. Instead of soup, use Campbell's soap. Coca-Cola as an alternative. Iraq-related newspapers from different years all have the same headline. Strange dreams are reported by locals. The investigation is still ongoing. Leonard's blood ran cold as he discovered a guest register book behind the counter. Names, dates, and signatures of persons who had reportedly visited Dishon Township during the previous few decades were scattered throughout the pages. The dates, however, were not feasible. Many of the writings were in handwriting that appeared to develop and evolve as Leonard looked on, while some were from years before the town could have existed, and others were from the future. For 9 years, Leonard Hayes had been transporting auto parts across the desert on Interstate 10 between Tucson and El Paso. Between the two cities, he was familiar with every exit, rest area, and mile marker. Thus, on a moonless night in August 2021, at precisely 3:33 a.m., Leonard saw exit 66B in his headlights and realized that something was seriously wrong with the earth. There was no map showing the exit. Leonard had researched DOT, GPS, and roadway atlases. There had never been an exit 66B on this section of I-10, and there had been construction reports for years. 65, 67, and 69 were the numbers of the standard exits. No 66 of any kind, much less a 66B, was present. However, it was there, conspicuously, marked with the typical green highway signs, replete with reflective text that shone brightly in the dark and attracted his headlights. The exit sign said, Dishon Township, services available in the familiar white letters on green background, that marked every interstate off-ramp across America. However, Leonard was unaware about Dishon Township. Furthermore, his charts showed that for 50 miles in all directions, this area of desert was nothing but barren ground. Leonard's logbook stated he was making good time, and his fuel gauge showed he had enough diesel to get to El Paso. It made little sense to take an unmarked exit that led to a non-existent town. However, there was something about the sign that made him slow down, turn right, and steer his 18-wheeler down the off-ramp into whatever was beyond the familiar glow of the interstate. Longer than necessary, The exit ramp descended slowly into a darkness that appeared thicker than usual at night. Only a few yards were illuminated by Leonard's headlights. Forward, as though the light were being absorbed by the blackness itself. It also felt odd on the pavement beneath his wheels. It seemed older and rougher, as though it had been constructed decades before the current interstate system. Leonard discovered a stop sign at the bottom of the ramp that appeared to have been hand-painted rather than manufactured. There was a two-lane road beyond it that vanished into darkness, so full that it appeared solid, apart from a dilapidated wooden sign that stated Pedition Township, population 0, in faded white paint. There were no building lights, no street lights, and no other indications of civilization. It was time for Leonard to turn around. He ought to have re-entered the interstate and acted as though he had never noticed the impossibly difficult exit. However, truck drivers are always inquisitive, and the mystery of this obscure hamlet drew him in like in his mind, a fishing line hooked. He put the car in first gear and rolled into the night. The paved road through Dishon Township had cracks and weeds were sprouting in almost intentional patterns through the asphalt. Buildings on both sides of the street were visible via Leonard's headlights, stores, residences, a gas station, even a tiny church that appeared to have a twisted steeple. However, all of the buildings had been deserted, dark and black for so long that nature had started to take them back. Despite the obvious abandonment, everything appeared so well preserved that it made Leonard's skin crawl. There were no indications of structural collapse, fire damage, or vandalism on the buildings. Despite the eerie silence that suggested no one had lived here for a long time, the paint looked new, the windows were unbroken, and the doors hung straight on their hinges. Years. After parking his vehicle in front of what looked like a general store, Leonard got out of his cab. There was complete quiet. No insects, no breeze, and no distant interstate traffic noises. His footfall also sounded muffled, as though the air itself was too dense to transmit sound clearly. The front door of the general shop was unlocked. Leonard discovered shelves filled with items that, while initially appearing normal, turned out to be incorrect. The brand labels on canned foods were familiar, if slightly different. Instead of soup, use Campbell's soap. Coca-Cola as opposed to Coca-Cola. Iraq-related newspapers from different years all have the same headline. Strange dreams are reported by locals. The investigation is still ongoing. Leonard's blood ran cold as he discovered a guest register book behind the counter. Names, dates, and signatures of persons who had reportedly visited Dishon were scattered across the pages. Township within the previous few decades. The dates, however, were not feasible. Many of the writings were in handwriting that appeared to develop and evolve as Leonard looked on, while some were from years before the town could have existed and others were from the future. During his 16 years of driving, Eddie Castellanos had transported every kind of cargo imaginable, but nothing had prepared him for the shipment he picked up at a Savannah, Georgia, funeral home on a muggy September night in 2022. According to the manifest, it was mortuary equipment headed for a New Orleans cemetery. Additionally, Eddie was greeted at the loading dock by the funeral director, who strangely insisted that the delivery be made before sunrise. 6 elaborate wooden caskets, each made of dark mahogany with brass fittings that shone in the fluorescent lights of the loading dock, made up the cargo. These were exquisitely crafted coffins, the type that affluent families commissioned for their departed loved ones. Eddie found it strange that they were so weighty. The funeral director assured everyone that the caskets were empty, but it took a forklift to load each one. When Eddie asked about the weight, the funeral director said it was premium construction, lead-lined solid wood for conservation. The New Orleanian families value fine craftsmanship. However, while he signed the papers, his hands trembled, and he kept looking over his shoulder, as though he was waiting for someone to come out of the shadowed funeral house. They seemed to settle into the trailer bed with unusual finality, as if they belonged there, Eddie said, adding extra straps and chains to secure the caskets in his trailer. He was given a sealed document by the funeral director, envelope with detailed delivery instructions, emphasizing that the caskets must never be opened while being transported. The first hour of the drive went smoothly as Eddie made his way toward Interstate 16 through the suburban sprawl of Savannah. But as he got on the freeway and started to cruise, he saw that his truck was working harder than it should, that his engine had to work harder to keep up, and that hills that should have been simple climbs were now difficult. Eddie. To check his load, he pulled into a weigh station outside of Mon. His blood ran cold at the scale reading. His truck was significantly heavier than the 80,000 lb legal limit, weighing close to $120,000 lb. However, his manifest states that the 6 caskets should have only increased his weight by roughly 3,000 pounds. In some way, in the first 100 meters of the trip, his baggage had grown by 40,000 pounds. Chuck, a seasoned veteran who worked as a weigh station inspector, strolled about Eddie's trailer looking perplexed. "Your axle weights are off the charts," Chuck remarked while looking at his clipboard. "But how 6 empty coffins could weigh this much is beyond me. Are you certain that the trailer contains nothing else?" Even as he spoke, Eddie could feel his truck sinking a little, as though the cargo was still gaining weight. He reassured Chuck that he was just transporting the caskets specified on his manifest. Chuck looked hesitant to write a ticket for something he couldn't explain, but he did make notes on his citation pad. Eddie's truck found it difficult to achieve 40 mph on flat terrain once they were back on the highway. As they passed his crawling tractor, other cars honked angrily, and Eddie had to alert quicker traffic to his presence by using his danger lights. The engine temperature gauge was gradually approaching the red zone, and his fuel usage had increased. Around midnight, Eddie started to hear noises coming from his trailer as he got closer to the Georgia-Alabama line. Initially, the only sounds were cracking and settling, which may be attributed to the excessive shifting of weight during turns and stops. However, with time, the sounds grew more purposeful and regular, as if someone from the inside, knocking, on wood. There was a pattern to the knocking. 3 slow taps, followed by another 3 taps and a break. Eddie's cab was filled with an unsettling drumbeat that seemed to emanate from all 6 caskets at once and reverberated through the trailer walls. He attempted to drown out the noise by cranking up his radio. The knocking, which seemed to be demanding his attention from whatever was inside the caskets, became louder and more persistent. Eddie walked back to check his trailer after pulling into a 24-hour truck stop close to Montgomery. The caskets had the same appearance as when they were loaded: gorgeous, pricey, and securely fastened. However, when Eddie put his hand, he sensed tremors in the wood of the closest coffin, as though something was shifting within. Even though the night air was cool, the brass fittings felt warm to the touch. As Eddie was checking his goods, a fellow trucker called Sam happened to stroll by. "I could hear you coming from a great distance. Looks like you have some disgruntled passengers back there," Sam added. Sam's gaze darkened as Eddie described the weight issues and the enigmatic noises. "I've heard stories about shipments like this," Sam said. "Coffins that become heavier as you move them farther. Cargo that should be silent but produces noise. There are rumors that certain funeral establishments don't always wait before they put people in boxes. They should be dead. Sometimes people are buried alive, and until they are properly laid to rest, their spirits cannot rest." Eddie rejected Sam's supernatural interpretation, but he was unable to ignore his own senses' proof. The hammering from the trailer had turned into what sounded like scraping, and his truck was now so heavy it could hardly climb the slightest incline. Wood being clawed at by dozens of fingernails from the within. Eddie's heater was going at full blast, but the temperature inside his cab started to drop as he drove across Alabama. His breath escaped in apparent puffs, and ice crystals formed on his windows. As the scratching became increasingly desperate, Eddie heard what sounded like muffled voices requesting assistance in languages he didn't comprehend. The stench that started to permeate his taxi was the worst. The delicious, horrible smell of decay mixed with something other, something that reminded Eddie of damp dirt and old graveyards, rather than the antiseptic smell of embalming fluid. Eddie had to breathe through his mouth to prevent gagging as the stench intensified with every mile. By the time Eddie arrived at the border with Mississippi, his truck weighed well than 200,000 pounds, based on a handheld scale at a rest stop. Eddie's tires were showing signs of serious stress, and the trailer axles were moaning beneath the impossible load. Other truck drivers at the rest area could hear the caskets' loud knocking and scratching from 50 yards away. Eddie dialed the Savannah funeral home, but the number was not connected. Even though it was late, no one responded when he tried the New Orleans cemetery. The sealed envelope's delivery instructions directed him to a location that his GPS didn't recognize. Eddie was stranded with cargo that appeared intent on clawing its way out of captivity, literally wrecking his truck in the process. As Eddie got closer to Louisiana, the voices from the trailer became more distinct. Individual appeals for assistance, accounts of being buried alive, and charges against the funeral home that had delivered them were all discernible to him. The voices described being buried too soon, waking up in the dark and discovering they had been declared dead while still alive, and tearing at coffin lids until their fingers bled. Eddie became further horrified upon realizing that he wasn't carrying empty coffins. He was transporting the bodies of those who had been buried alive, whose souls were imprisoned in their caskets, and becoming more powerful every mile from the location of their unjustly buried bodies. There was no physical rise in weight. It had a spiritual quality, the cumulative pain and anger of the wrongfully interred deceased. The turning point was when Eddie's truck eventually broke down entirely outside of New Orleans. Under the unfathomable weight of his cargo, the trailer axles buckled, the engine seized, and the entire outfit fell apart. Eddie heard the caskets behind him crack apart as he crawled from the debris, spilling decades' worth of collected pain into the Louisiana night. From the wrecked trailer came 6 figures, not ghosts or zombies, but something much worse. They were the souls of those who had suffered, who had been buried before their time, whose anger had grown in wooden boxes until it was strong enough to have an impact on the material world. In search of the funeral home directors and dishonest officials who had benefited from their hasty burial, they deliberately made their way toward the lights of New Orleans. Eddie never drove a truck again, but he lived through the incident. He spending weeks in mental health facilities, talking endlessly about the caskets that held the intense rage of the wrongfully deceased. The insurance inquiry determined that Eddie had damaged his own truck on purpose after experiencing a mental breakdown. However, nobody might account for the scores of witnesses who reported hearing the noises or the unusual weight measurements. The 6 figures never came out of his trailer again. However, funeral homes began to encounter unexplained issues, equipment malfunctions, and mysterious mishaps, and employees who resign after disclosing experiences with irate ghosts calling for justice for those who were buried too soon. A few loads are also heavy for any truck to transport, particularly when the weight is derived from the cumulative anguish of spirits who passed over too soon and won't stop until their tales are spoken. Hello? Spoken. Hello?